These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. All around Israel, polytheist nations built temples to their gods because they pretty generally believed that their gods could come to inhabit the statues they created and sanctified and could live within the temple as their house. They not only believed that this was possible for gods, but that the gods positively desired such a living arrangement. Because the ancient Israelites believed in only one God, ruling only a single nation from a single city who had a single spiritual body, he obviously only needed one temple in which to incarnate. Oh wait, no. Because God is transcendent and immaterial, he is capable of walking with anyone anywhere, which was why he needs a specific place to reside. Oh wait, no. Anyway, there's very little doubt that the Jews had a temple. There are a few radical skeptics who doubt the existence of the first temple, but that is a bit excessive. Even if you don't believe in Solomon or the United Monarchy, it seems pretty clear that, generally speaking, there was at least a temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem of some sort or another by the time of the final kings of Judah. Then, of course, there was definitely a second temple, which is strongly historically attested and was well known to have been destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, following yet another Jewish revolt. But many of the details of the temple, aside from the brute facts of its construction, are highly uncertain and frequently debated, especially when you get to the early years of the first temple, where very little is known even within Scripture. To have such a key structure so poorly understood makes all interpretation of the reality of early Yahwistic religion significantly harder. Now, an early draft of this episode looked through every single worship site, altar, and high place constructed in the early parts of the Old Testament, but that ran way long. I filled the entire episode without ever getting to a point. Really, I filled the whole episode without even getting into Exodus, which was a little bit silly. But for the most part, we can just summarize that whole thing by saying that there were a whole bunch of holy sites which were constructed and considered legitimate, and a bunch which the Bible authors considered illegitimate. And frequently the only difference that we can tell between the two, from what's often very brief descriptions, is the biblical author's evaluation of whether or not the altar builder had his heart in the right place. I mean, just for example, I suppose you could see this all the way at the beginning with Cain and Abel, and while interpretations vary wildly, a common reading is that each offered a similar ritual in offering to God, yet because Cain didn't have his heart in the right place, his was rejected, while his brother's was accepted. Now, as far as location goes, the Temple Mount today in Jerusalem is considered an incredibly holy site, of course. But prior to Solomon, there was no focus on specific location. People just sort of seem to have built altars wherever they happened to be when they needed to chat with God. High places were always preferred, and indeed, for all that high places becomes a slur later on in the story to refer to illegitimate worship sites, the approved altars and temples of God seem to also always be on raised elevations. Why? Because everyone knows that God lives in the sky, and you want to get as high up as possible to enhance your closeness with God. The point is really that Israelite worship sites strongly resemble the worship sites of cultures around them. They like mountains, though you definitely can't make your own mountain like the Mesopotamian ziggurats. That is one of the Hebrew morals of the Tower of Babel story. The worship sites involve offering sacrifice to God, though the theological issues make it hard to say for sure why the ancient Hebrews were doing these sacrifices compared to why the polytheists were doing it. We know why the polytheists were doing it. It was very strongly, I'm going to give you this sacrifice and you're going to give me whatever, blessings, you're not going to be mad at me. It's giving presents to someone to make them happy. Makes sense. Now they pretty clearly believe in the literal presence of God. Sometimes it's represented by a stone. Sometimes in the Ark of the Covenant, it's thought that God is literally sitting on the lid, the way a pagan idol would sit on its carrier palanquin. And the language of God's presence with the Ark is, in a few places, so similar that some people think the original Ark really may have had a cult statue of God on top, which later got removed in religious reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, assuming the Ark was even still there at that time. But we're not anywhere close to Josiah and Hezekiah, especially not at the rate we're going. Oh my goodness. Anyway, the people of Israel started out building altars just anywhere they happened to be. And even if you don't believe that the accounts up to this point, and especially in the early period, were historical, we can still say pretty confidently that these people had some sort of tradition involving worship sites, because that's just what all ancient people do, absent some special reason not to. Now then one day there was a massive plague in Israel. This is what we closed out with last episode. King David felt he was religiously responsible for ending the plague through prayer, much as we saw the Hittite king Mursili II doing way back in our Hittite series. Except the place he was supposed to go at this point, the place of power, was at Gibeon, which was some distance away. And Chronicles tells us that David could not go to that place because he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. And of course, that sword of the angel, the one that was killing people, was the plague. David didn't want to leave home because he was scared of a plague. And so he simply decided that he would select his own holy site, with blackjack and hookers, on the threshing floor atop Mount Moriah. This site would of course become the Temple Mount, and thus the only valid site of Yahwistic worship, according to the command of God through Moses in Deuteronomy 12, which goes, "But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies around, so that you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contributions that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord." Now, by citing this verse, I have made some of my listeners angry. Some of you are screaming at your podcast player that Deuteronomy didn't exist until King Josiah, and like I say, I promise I'll get there, though it'll be more episodes between then and now than originally planned. And now some of you are already writing me a letter that the interpretation of that passage is not as exclusivist as traditionally understood because of various poeticisms in Hebrew grammar. Basically, the idea that even though it sounds like God's only saying you have to do the temple in one place, that's not actually exclusively one place. And in fact, my own denomination has folks who argue this, though in truth, as fine as these more expansive interpretations are in themselves, the overall context of the entire Deuteronomistic project, that is, Deuteronomy all the way through Kings, makes it pretty clear that the school of thought behind this set of books is one of radical unification of worship. Don't go build your temples and holy places just wherever you want. Build one temple in Jerusalem. Everything happens there. But then perhaps most importantly, by citing this particular textual tradition of this verse, the ESV based ultimately here on the Masoretic text of the scriptures, I've upset the 822 living members of the Israelite Samaritan community, who are a fascinating group of people who seem to quite validly trace their lineage back to northern Israel in at least the Persian period, and with a reasonable claim to have been there long before. I was going to sort of hold off and not discuss the Samaritans, that's the northern Israelites, until we actually get to the point where the monarchy splits, but I've been reading about the modern Samaritans lately, and their story, as far as they're concerned, starts right here in Deuteronomy, or at least the chapter right before the one I just read. So we're going to go on a tangent. Now, so for those who don't actually know, we're about to move in our story from David to King Solomon. And after King Solomon dies, the United Kingdom of Israel is going to split into two kingdoms, the northern Israel and the southern Judah. Now, our traditional biblical narrative will mostly follow Judah and consider the temple in Jerusalem to be the center of the spiritual universe. But for the northern kingdom, they're going to come to be named Samaria, after the geographic region around their capital city of Samaria. Now, they will get destroyed by the Assyrians. I guess spoiler alert there. But many are going to remain, and we're going to look at that in much more detail later. Not everybody actually gets kicked out of Israel when the Assyrians show up. And during the period when the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, these inhabitants of Samaria, who do worship Yahweh in their own distinct, though often similar way, they're going to get permission in parallel from the Persians to rebuild their own temple in the north, around Mount Gerizim. Now, these northern Samaritans will go on to have a fascinating and sort of neglected parallel history, and they're never going to be expelled from the region in the way that the southern Jews are, probably because they're just nicer. I don't know. Now, of course, the Samaritans and the Jews are going to come to hate each other, and this becomes some of the drama during the story of Jesus. And that's all that most people actually know about the Samaritans. But then to briefly summarize, to get way out of the oldest stories territory, after the Jews do get kicked out, the Samaritans are going to do pretty well for themselves during the Roman and Byzantine period. There's a Byzantine persecution in the 400s CE, and overall they grow to maybe 1 or 1.5 million people around the region of Israel. Then the Muslim period comes, and it's pretty rough for them. But, of course, as the prophet Isaiah, who the Samaritans reject as illegitimate, said, a remnant will remain. By 1917, according to their own numbers, it was a remnant of a remnant. About 100 people left around the modern town of Nablus. As of March 2023, when I took a look at their website, they claimed to number 822 people in 2 communities, one in West Bank and one on Mount Gerizim. And their website, the Samaritan Update, is It's really something else, I gotta tell you. Anyway, that history, all that history is interesting enough, and I've skipped over some really neat stuff that throws a lot of the Second Temple period into greater perspective. But what makes the Samaritans really interesting is their religious beliefs. They are, in many respects, quite a lot like modern Jews, at least the Orthodox ones. But the Samaritans only keep to the first 5 books of the Bible, rejecting all later prophets as fakers and all later texts as non-inspired at best. The Samaritans themselves place the start of their history, as distinct from Judahite history, all the way back in Deuteronomy. You see, their version of Deuteronomy, which tracks more closely with certain aspects of the very earliest texts of the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, changes the tense of the Lord's command from "I will choose" to "I have chosen," in context of choosing a holy site. So it's in the Jewish version, God says, "I'm going to choose a holy site." In the Samaritan version, God says, "I have chosen my holy site." Now that may not seem like much, but given the context of the speech in Deuteronomy, God begins by stating that God's people should do stuff on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and then concludes the speech by announcing that all these things should be written on a shrine of the law, which should have an altar, and sacrifices should be made on this altar. So think about this logically. God says you should only have sacrifices in one place. And in the Samaritan version, it says you should only have sacrifices in one place which he has already chosen. Past tense rather than future tense. And then says, by the way, hey guys, build an altar with these very laws on it and have sacrifices there. Now that particular place, Mount Gerizim, the so-called Mountain of Blessings, was believed by the Samaritans to be the one and only proper location for the one and only temple of God. The Jewish version of that same text puts the shrine of the law on Mount Ebal, the mountain of curses, which to me is a far more interesting place to put it. I mean, really thinking symbolically, we're talking about building the law upon a foundation. So, symbolically, should the foundation of the law, which this altar is enshrining in stone, should the foundation be upon the mountain of curses for those who break the law, or the mountain of blessings for those who keep the law? I mean, both do seem like valid options for various reasons, but the mountain of blessings does seem like the more straightforward and conventional option, and if you're trying to maybe condemn a rival religious group, saying that their shrine was constructed upon the foundation of curses, it's not like it's the only nasty thing that the Bible does to people they don't like changing everyone who has Baal in their name to Bosheth, replacing the name of an unfavored god with the word shame. So they definitely do stoop to name-calling in the Bible. Which, I don't know. Just something to think about. Anyway, the Samaritans follow up Deuteronomy with a secular history, which in the English versions I've read consider Joshua and many of the subsequent judges to have been a set of kings. And now whether this is just a translation issue, I mean, we talked about how shoftim for judges is sort of a complicated word, but maybe there's a more significant difference here. I'm not enough of an expert to tell you, especially not in Samaritan theology. But in their telling of history, all of Israel did pretty well during the Judges period and was mostly loosely unified until the wicked and corrupt priest Samuel begins to defile the practices and sets up a worship site down south to trick everyone. At which point God withdrew his favor from everyone. The good, gentle kings or judges, whatever they were replaced by a series of hyper-militaristic tyrants, and eventually warfare ruined the Holy Land for everyone. And actually, I read the Samaritan version of Saul and David, which is not very nice, after I had already put together those Saul and David episodes for the most part. And so the fact that we both sort of saw, especially David, as a bit of a blood-soaked warlord, is it a coincidence? Is it just what's there? I don't know. It really is a fascinating alternate version of events. It's far enough off track that we can't really get too deep into it here, but it ultimately leads into a pretty key question. When did the Samaritans actually emerge with the set of beliefs and books that they currently have? Now, you may notice that this is pretty similar to the core question of this entire Israel series: when did the Jews emerge? And pretty similarly is unanswerable. But the mix of narrative and archaeology for the Samaritans specifically is a bit different from the Jews, and bringing them into the mix certainly adds the question: where can we see northern and southern biases in our various texts? And given the enmity between the two peoples at various historical points, how could these religious texts have transferred between peoples if we keep to the later dates of authorship? That is to say, if we know that the Jews and Samaritans hated each other pretty much completely from the Persian period onward, does it not make sense to put like an upper bound on when the set of books shared between the two were composed at prior to this hatred? Why would they share books if they hated each other? If Deuteronomy is a super late text and North and South hate each other, then once one side invents it, wouldn't it make more sense for the other side to go, "You're just making that up. You're just making that up"? That's what they did with all the prophetic books. The Samaritans, they do have a version of Joshua, which they don't consider inspired, but tracks kind of with the Joshua that we have. But then after that, Samuel, Kings, whatever, they just say, those are just, they're either made up, they're fake prophets, or like the wisdom literature, whatever. It's just wisdom, it's not inspired. I don't have the answer to any of this, and I know there exist a few decent options out there. Maybe we're going to have more chances to continue poking at it, probably inconclusively, as we look at the formation of northern Israel and southern Judah. And hopefully the episode after next is when we're going to have that split. Seriously, I thought we'd be done with Solomon on the 4th episode of this series, but hopefully you're enjoying the ride, even as sort of scattered as we're getting. So to summarize all of whatever we've been talking about, how many holy sites were the Yahwists supposed to have? That's the question we're getting at here. Looking at the pre-monarchical period, they seem to have had a bunch. Look at the patriarchs. They build whenever they want. Look at the Judges period. They build a whole bunch of them. Looking at the split between the North and the South, they nowadays claim to have had one each. Nowadays, the Jews said we only had one temple, it was in Jerusalem, and the Samaritans said we only had one temple, and it was in Gerizim. But if we look at both archaeology and the strident claims of the biblical narrators, it seems there were a ton of holy places still being built and attended during the monarchical period. We'll see this more in upcoming episodes, but the fact that biblical writers complain about idolatrous temples around the Holy Land, and even sometimes idolatry within the Jerusalem temple itself, indicates at the very least that there was no period of pre-exile Israel that was free from a significant number of Canaanite polytheists. Indeed, it raises the question of, outside the few reform periods, how certain are we that anyone was actually endorsing monotheism until pretty late in the game? But those aren't temples to Yahweh, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that there was ever supposed to be more than one proper temple. Except that archaeology's found the remains of multiple Yahwist temples. You have some like the Elephantine Temple, built quite far away from the Holy Land down in southern Egypt, but that may or may not count depending on how much you want to argue about it. But then there's the Tel Ared Temple, which was built along the same lines as the tabernacle. It's within a day's walk of Jerusalem, and it appears to have been in service from about the 950s to the destruction of Judah. Allowing for some fuzziness with those dates, that's basically the entire First Temple period that this Tel Ared Temple was up and running. Then there are some other proposed worship sites, some with altars, around Judah and Israel through this period as well, though of course every single one of them is contested for obvious reasons, though not all of them are archaeologically contested. Some of them are really just theologically contested. But what's the point of all this? The point is that the archaeological and textual facts presented today can be read to support a literalist view of the temple. That is exactly what, there was only one proper worship site. Every other one was illegitimate and was idolatrous and Canaanite and terrible. But it can also be presented to support extremely skeptical views of the temple. And you can find papers and YouTubers arguing these points back and forth far more than I'm going to. My own view has actually been quite a bit shaken by how compelling the Samaritan view is, and especially how similar it is in many ways to the traditional views. But the point is that we simply don't know. We don't know what cult practice actually looked like in the First Temple, beyond some generalizations that would apply equally to a monotheist iconoclast and a polytheist syncretist view of the Yahwistic faith in this period. Those who claim to know are starting with a theological perspective, then finding proof for that theological perspective, rather than letting the perspective emerge solely from the facts. This is an occupational hazard of archaeology, but it sits a lot easier for most people when this uncertainty doesn't touch on key worldview elements. Speaking of uncertainty, because we've gone all over the place this episode, and because we need to get a bit back on track, and I don't really have a segue for this. Another thing that's highly uncertain, or at least heavily debated, is King David's role among the priesthood. The king's account has ended David's life. It's left him one final farewell speech that we're going to look at later, but the Chronicles account has 8 more chapters, all about David preparing the construction of the temple. In chapter 22, he organizes what we could call the secular side of the temple, hiring stone cutters and importing timber, as well as giving instructions to his son Solomon. In chapter 23, Solomon is raised up to co-ruler, something not uncommon to smooth out some ancient power transitions. But then David counts the Levites and begins to assign particular duties to particular families. Some have duties assigned directly, and others have their duties assigned by lot, which is to say, some are selected by David, and some are selected through kleromantic divination, and all of which are selected by God through these two equal means. Now in chapter 25, he builds a 288-man choir, which would later have a tremendous reputation. Of course, most famous of the musicians from this age is David himself, in some traditions credited as the author of 73 psalms. Did he actually write all these psalms? Did he actually have a great personal music talent? There's truly no way to know. There's no real reason to think he wasn't at least somewhat musical, given the degree to which he is famous as a harpist and poet. But on the other hand, ancient kings often claim credit for the works produced by their court or subjects. And there is an ongoing debate as to whether even the Psalms of David were meant as psalms written by him, or if the attributions actually say that they were written for David. My own assumption is that even if many of the psalms were falsely attributed to David or his court, why would anyone think it's worth attributing anything to him if he didn't already have a reputation for poetry? But of course that's not proof, it's just a line of reasoning. Anyway, the real business here is the organization of the Levites, and we hear about who is chosen as gatekeepers and treasurers. After this, it transitions seamlessly into a listing of army officers, tribal leaders, and royal administrators, suggesting that the organization of the priesthood was fundamentally as much a part of David's kingly power as the organization of the government. Remember, in most ancient communities, the priesthood was strongly tied to the government itself, even if it did have a certain amount of independence. But remember, we have been told in our narrative that Israelite kings are not like ancient kings, and they are not to act as priests. And this leaves us with a puzzle. You see, as we've mentioned before, throughout the ancient Near East, kings had three fundamental roles. They were military leaders, supreme judges, and intercessors with God or the gods. Now, some kings, of course, were always more focused on one or the other, but it was generally thought that a good king would be at least seen to do work in all three categories. But not Saul, according at least to the biblical narrator. You'll remember that Saul got in trouble, specifically for doing priestly functions, which would be the royal prerogative in any neighboring nation. It led to conflict with the prophet Samuel and is ultimately blamed for the downfall of Saul's house. If the prophet was selected by God, this would have eternal consequences, and if he was only a religious leader among men, then it ended up having political consequences. Of course, Saul was never, throughout his life, without priests from the legitimate Levite priestly class, just as he was just without the support of a charismatic prophet and that prophet's faction, who would end up writing a really important book. But once David enters the scene, these same rules no longer seem to apply. David consults with the Lord. He builds an altar. He arranges the Levites the same way he arranges his bureaucrats. He moves the Ark of the Covenant wherever he wants, with no mention of the pillar of smoke that had previously been the sole authorized guide for the Ark. He offers sacrifices on behalf of the nation. He blesses people. He eats showbread, though that one involved deception. And he leads a religious procession, singing and dancing at the head of the Levites, wearing high priestly garments, the ephod and linens. Saul got in trouble for snatching a quick prayer while Samuel was delayed, but David is basically pretending to be a priest. Now we'll leave the question of Saul aside for a bit. Was David a priest? Now the strongest data point for this is Psalm 110 with the mention of a priest after the order of Melchizedek. But it's heavily debated whether this is actually referring to David or to Solomon or to the Messiah or to something about the last days. In most kingdoms, we would expect the king to act like this, but we know for certain that David was not a Levitical priest. And it's very hard to tie David to a Melchizedek priesthood, even in those denominations that actually make a big deal out of the Melchizedek priesthood, like the Latter-day Saints. Now, a cynical perspective would say that the kings who get called out for infringing on priestly rights, most notably Saul, and then later we get Jeroboam and Uzziah, get called out not so much for being inappropriate, but for opposing the Yahwist faction. It is pretty clear that they had royal priests through all their transgressions, meaning that any opposition in the First Temple period to any of these kings was a minority position, or at least a sectarian one that was not always in power. And this shouldn't be too surprising, since it isn't like modern-day Yahweh worshippers are any more unified than they were back then. In modern history, we can imagine that Martin Luther thought himself quite pious as he transgressed against the rules of the Roman Catholic interpretation of God. And even with modern ecumenicism, there's some pretty rough stuff that gets said by the Catholic Church about the early Protestants. It's no stretch to imagine the same dynamic going on here, where Saul and the unrighteous kings, we'll see soon enough, imagine themselves to be quite pious according to their own denominational interpretation, you could say. Anyway, I've been wibbling and wobbling a fair bit this episode because for all that I've spent the last few weeks on just these two topics in my own research, the truth is I don't have good answers for you on any of this. We get ourselves deep into issue after issue asking if the historical count is reliable, if the narrator is reliable, and wondering what facts we might be missing to square the circle of both temple and priesthood. Now, the purely skeptical, cynical answer does sort of get tempting here. None of this is real. It's all made-up propaganda. But taking that view has issues when the text is more reliable in other places. All this stuff is tied up with the historical stuff that seems reliable in other places. But that's all quite enough of that. So David's last act in life is to sleep with a young woman, Abishag the Shunammite. And the text insists that this was purely medical and nothing inappropriate was going on. And I know my wife wouldn't go for an excuse like that. I don't know if David's wives did or not. But then David gives a speech and dies. Chronicles skips the young woman and the power struggle and goes directly over to the time that Solomon was building the temple, because that's what it really cares about. But in our Deuteronomic record, we have turned the page finally from the book of Samuel to the book of Kings. And what a relief it is. And how odd is it that the very first words of the book of Kings are, well, you know, David died sleeping with a young foreign woman, but they definitely weren't doing anything inappropriate. Now on to Adonijah's rebellion. If anyone writes my history, they can put bad stuff in there, that's fine, but hopefully not on the first 4 lines of the first page. Of course, though we've moved into a new book, and our historian is apparently drawing on a new set of chronicles focused on the later kings, It's generally agreed by both traditionalists and skeptical scholars that both books of Samuel and both books of Kings, as we have them today, were compiled in a fairly unitary fashion, probably with most of it written during the last few reigns of the Judahite kings, and the finishing touches put on during the Babylonian exile. After all that's come before, it's nice to see everyone agreeing on something for once. Anyway, Kings opens with Adonijah, another son of David, whose name means Yahweh is the Lord, reminding the most radical of skeptics that Yahweh worship really was a thing in this early period, whatever form it may have taken. Anyway, Solomon appears to have been co-regent for a period of time during the last years of David's life, and so he presents himself as the natural candidate for kingship. Adonijah gathers some soldiers and chariots around him and makes his own bid. The court splits, with the famous general Joab and Abiathar, descendant of Eli and significant priest, joining Adonijah, while Solomon gets Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet. Now, on balance, Adonijah actually seems to have the more prominent courtiers, at least from what we've seen in the narrative up to this point, as well as a claim to have been born in a more legitimate marriage, referencing the whole trouble with Bathsheba. Solomon, meanwhile, has been anointed by David's command and named co-ruler. So he actually holds the throne itself when David passes away, which gives him a pretty good claim in his own right. Now Solomon, in all his famous wisdom, makes the first move by telling Adonijah that they can have peace if everyone just accepts him as king. And in the opening moves, everything seems calm. Then Adonijah wants to sleep with Abishag the Shunammite. Now, if nothing happened between Abishag and King David, then the woman is just a random servant. There should be no problem with Adonijah taking her to be wife. However, if Abishag had been a concubine of the former king, then a man sleeping with her after the king's death was, in the language of Near Eastern politics, claiming to be the successor of the king, inheriting the harem. Given Solomon's extreme reaction of jumping pretty much straight to the death penalty for treason for having suggested such a thing, it is much harder to take seriously the claim from the first chapter that Abishag was not doing anything sexual with David. Anyway, even though there's a little power struggle, there's no significant rebellion here because Solomon, whose name means peace, takes the most common Near Eastern royal path to a peaceful, non-rebellious succession by sending his man Benaiah to pretty much just go around and murder Adonijah and all his supporters. Though the priest Abiathar does get away with just losing his position because it's never good to kill a priest. The only summary we need here is the last line of the chapter. Then the king commanded Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. And with that, we've finally finished the story of King David, and are finally inching ever closer to the actual history that everyone's really excited about. Solomon and the division of the kingdom should only take one more episode, which I know I've sort of expected that before, but Solomon's story really is much shorter than David's, and really only has one significant issue of note for an historical analysis. So join us next time as we look at the tale of wise and wealthy King Solomon, source of a million legends, and ask ourselves, just how rich was Solomon in fact? And by extension, what can we say about how wealthy and powerful was Israel, at the peak of its legendary golden age. Thank you for listening.